Good morning, everybody. Or good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining from. My name is Sarah Dorr. I am the Director of Professional Development at the International Studies Association. For those of you who are not familiar with the International Studies Association, or ISA, it is the largest interdisciplinary organization dedicated to understanding global affairs, and it's currently hosted by Global Affairs at the University of Connecticut. So today we have a fantastic panel on women in international relations, global perspectives. We're going to hear from our panelists first, and then there'll be an opportunity for discussion. We encourage you to put your questions or comments in the chat feature, which is enabled. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Yana Rogers, who will be moderating today. Yana, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah, and what a pleasure to join this exciting and interesting panel. As Sarah said, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, depending on where you are. I am Yana Rogers, a professor and also newly department chair in the Labor Studies and Employment Relations Department at Rutgers University in New Jersey, and also an ex-president of the International Association for Feminist Economics, which is very much related to this panel because of the resistance to feminist analysis that has been happening in the discipline, as talked a lot about by a small cohort of international relations scholars. And that will be part of our topic today in this panel. So our panel will be discussing some of the gendered challenges pertaining to international relations, development, peace building, and policy, as well as the contributions of women scholar teachers like our panelists in shaping more inclusive and responsive approaches in theory and practice in the discipline of international relations. We have three accomplished and incredibly knowledgeable panelists for you today. First is our panel organizer, as well as our first speaker, Dr. Debotri Dar. She is Associate Professor at Jindal School of International Affairs at Jindal Global University in India. And Dr. Dar, her interdisciplinary work engages the gendered intersections of international relations, development, and humanitarian education. Her research and teaching interests span women in international relations, peace and conflict studies, with attention to gender violence in war and humanitarian law, gender and development, gender and education and policy. And she also has a long-lasting interest in women in literature, and she's a published novelist. Dr. Dar earned her BA in economics with honors from Sri Ram College, Delhi University, as well as a master's in women's studies with distinction from Oxford University, where she specialized in gender and development. And she earned a PhD in women's and gender studies at Rutgers University. And that's where I met Dr. Dar many years ago at Rutgers. And starting in 2015, Dr. Dar lectured on policies to address sexual violence, feminist theory, and women in literature at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor in the US. She has incredibly authored and edited 7 books. She's published numerous book chapters, and she has given lectures all over the world at some of the world's best institutions. It's really an incredible honor to have Dr. Dar speaking on this panel. Our second panelist is Dr. Rebecca Petty. She's an associate professor in international relations at the University of Macedonia in Greece. She holds a Bachelor of Arts from the Department of Balkan, Slavic, and Oriental Studies, and 2 master's degrees, as well as a master, one in political economy from the University of Sheffield, and the other a Master of Philosophy in International Relations from the University of Cambridge. And she earned her PhD from the Department of International and European Studies at the University of Macedonia. Her expertise is in international relations of small states, international relations of the EU, and international relations in the Eastern Mediterranean. She's published widely and has gotten funding from some major sources. And in terms of leadership, Rebecca is the co-chair of the Small States in World Politics section with the European International Studies Association. And our third panelist today is Dr. Kara Ann Hooser. She is an assistant instructional professor in the Committee on International Relations at the University of Chicago. And she also has affiliations in the Political Science Department and the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality. Dr. Hooser earned her PhD in political science from Ohio State University, where she specialized in international relations. Her research weaves together feminist and postcolonial thought, peace and conflict studies, African politics and security, and the layered role of gender in shaping the aftermaths of war. She's done quite a bit of research on how everyday people make sense of peace and how gendered expectations persist and transform long after formal conflict ends. So it is such a pleasure to have these three speakers today. And without any further ado, I will turn the floor over to Debotri. Each speaker will have 5 to 7 minutes for their opening comments, and then we will have some free-flowing discussion based on the points raised, followed by Q&A. Debotri, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I wanted to thank Sarah and Kat for letting me organize this panel. Many, many thanks to you, Yana, for agreeing to chair it, and to our wonderful co-panelists. And last but not the least, the audience. Your presence is very valued and very appreciated for this very important conversation on women in international relations. So in organizing this panel and in really working in this area for a long time, one of the first few things you notice is that there have just been very few women in the field in general, and that this world of war and peace, if you will, has traditionally been very gendered, and by that I mean it has been traditionally very male. And that's of course ironical, because while we'd understand that to be the case in when we talk about war, that's also apparently the case when we talk about peace. So now we know that cross-culturally, the stereotypes around women is that, women are more diplomatic, we're more peaceful, we're, sort of socialized to kind of hold on. And, and there's all kinds of talk about how the world would have had fewer wars if there'd been more women in power. Interestingly enough, in the last decade, including, some studies that have come out in 2017, 18, and then later in 2022, 23, which are all suggesting that around 80% of the world's ambassadors are men, and around 90% of the world's peace negotiators are also men. And so we understand that the world of diplomacy is precisely about peace, about avoiding war, right? About being able to not have war. And that world too is sort of peopled so much by men. And this is very cross-cultural, and my global trajectories across the world have sort of shown that no matter what kind of differences we find, something that remains pretty consistent is, again, that there are more men than women, right? And I know I'm sort of using a very simplistic binary here, but I think our audience understands what we mean. And so in an article that I had authored last year, I was looking at the two countries that my heart has called home, that's US and India. And in these two countries, it's interesting that out of all of the ambassadors that we have had, each country has had to the other, there have precisely been 4 women. And so I think the US has sent about, it's over 30 ambassadors to India. We've sent about, around the same, and just about four of them have been women. And as we go down the ranks too, we have seen improvements. Again, I don't want to paint a very dismal picture of no change absolutely from the 1980s that we are talking about. There have been improvements, and there've certainly been, and part of my mission is also to, I'm starting a panel where we're talking about women in diplomacy, where I want to highlight the achievements of the women who are there and the fantastic work that they're accomplishing, often under, hard circumstances. But the fact again remains that there is that discrepancy. The second point I want to kind of bring up is that obviously just adding more women is not enough, because adding more women is not the same as a feminist analysis. And oftentimes there's been there's a lot of research, and I think the most recent article I was reading was from the Peace Research Institute in Norway, which suggested that even with a higher number of women in foreign policy, oftentimes the structural barriers were such that uh, an increase in the number of women didn't necessarily translate into a feminist agenda, because again there were limits to what, even women ambassadors can do, because at the end of the day, they're working under constraints. Another point that's important to bring up here is that for those of us who come from a women's and gender studies background, as I do, as Jana mentioned, that's where we met at Rutgers. We talk about gender in an intersectional way, and so we don't talk about women in enough, as a category, but we talk about how gender intersects with race and, economic markers of identity and other sort of social markers to create different kinds of possibilities. And race has been a concern not just in terms of looking at the racial underpinnings of the discipline within, say, the developed world, including the United States, but it kind of affects us in the global South in a very different way, because we again come from countries that have been colonized for centuries, and so the developmental needs were very, very much more, and many parts of the world were again mired in conflict, and there needed to be attention paid to that. And in recent times, several countries in the global south, and certainly India has been, among the top in that list, where these countries have been talking about taking a place at the, high table of IR, if you will. We've talked about reforms in the United Nations, and we've also sort of talked about, and I won't get too much into this part because I'm sure it'll come up in the, in Rebecca's talk, and then later on when we discuss, but the larger geopolitical situation in the world, where we see certain wars as more deserving of our attention than other wars, and what it has meant for economically for some countries in the global South. And so, so the racial aspect of it also remains important locally, also, where maybe, even members of the audience are joining from, but also in terms of global equity issues, that's important. Speaking again of rebuilding, especially, war-torn societies, etc. I want to quickly sort of talk about a very important United Nations Security Council resolution that talks about that, which is Resolution 1325. I know that Kat will. Gara will talk more about it, where it's the Women, Peace and Security agenda, the WPS agenda, and that's very much about recognizing the disproportionate impact of war and armed conflict on women, and talking about bringing more women in and their communities in addressing peace building and peacekeeping and transitional justice. And the part of the WPS agenda, as I said, Kara will talk more about this, and a lot of her research is on this. The part of the WPS agenda that has been very important to my work for almost a decade now has been the part that focuses on gender violence as a weapon of war. And the way we have been talking about it is that we don't see gender violence, even when it is youth war, as it has been across conflicts around the world, but that we talk about it as not different from peacetime, but really just an exacerbation of what goes on in peacetime in terms of gender violence, in peacetime. And when I was teaching at the University of Michigan, I taught a course on gender violence and war in the state for several years. And here in India, the Jindal School of International Affairs, I'm teaching again in another iteration of that course, and also talking about the role of countries in the global south, India, in providing humanitarian aid and assistance, and what we can do, to sort of, do our part in this. But this is again a very important aspect of what I would consider this larger field of women in IR. And when I say that, not only have there not been, you know. That there's been a disproportionate representation of women in the field, but also that even when we have had more women, traditional IR has not looked at some of these things. So traditional IR, unfortunately, has not looked at people. It's looked at land. It's looked at that's been traditional IR really, not so much at people. And certainly when we look at communities, we haven't looked so much at the disproportionate impact on women, especially things like gender-based violence, etc. And I wanted to, the last thought was quickly that I wanted to connect it quickly with development, and what to my mind is a positive step by Bretton Woods institutions like the World Bank, is that the World Bank, etc., also that historically did not look at things like gender violence, have started looking at it now and have started considering it as a developmental issue. And I know that gender-based violence, again, is something that we talk about as a part of women-led development that we're talking about in India, that you can't really have development when there is not safety and there is not, security of human life, more than just land. And so I kind of want to end on that note, talking about not just more representation of women, but representation of more feminist issues and the particular issues that affect women, and that would include a range of these things. It would also include, I'm sure, Yana, when we have our discussion, we'll also talk about things like financial inclusion, etc., given your expertise. But all of these issues should be a part of international relations proper, which it currently isn't. And so what we are all trying to do here with our humble kind of attempts is really trying to broaden the field and trying to bring in some of these points too into the, and to have them be considered as a part of the mainstream rather than see it as alternative perspectives to IR. So I'll end my piece there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Debotri, very much for your comments. Dr. Petty, you are next.
Thank you, Jana, for your kind introduction. And thank you so much, Debotri and Sarah, for the invitation in such an important discussion for the field. I'm honored to participate, and I want to clarify that no, I'm out of this debate. I'm an outsider. I'm not a gender expert, and do not work in feminist IR. So I'm here to provide the European experience coming from a niche, actually, in international studies, as my research focuses on small states in international relations. And I hope that as an outsider, I will provide a slightly different perspective. But before starting with my intervention, I want to make a very short comment. I looked at the audience, and it seems that we have an all-women audience. So this speaks tones about the problem in the field, because this topic concerns the whole field, not only women in the field. And I want to welcome all the males in the audience, but still the majority are women. So the European experience, I guess, the European experience is slightly different from the Global South experience, at least in paper. All institutions have now committees for equality and inclusivity. They all uphold policies for equality and inclusivity in academia, at societal level, in policy circles. There is much awareness about equality and sensitivity. Has this changed the situation on the ground? If we look at the European International Studies Association, of whose governing board I'm a member, membership of female and male members are almost equal. 912 females, 987 males. If we look at our IR classes in our departments, there is also a balance with regard to gender. However, in most IR departments across Europe, women are only the 1/4 of academic staff. Around 25 to 30% are identified as female. And even for those who are in academia, the floor is very, very sticky. Women have offered far fewer of international relations most often cited articles, and for this reason, to some extent, far fewer field-defining articles than men. So women have not defined the field, have not set the IR agendas. Works from women in general are less cited. If we turn to practitioners, let me share some numbers which actually speak for themselves. Concerning the practitioners, according to a recent study from the European Parliament think tank, despite relative progress made in several countries around the world and multilateral organization, of course, in recent years, women remain largely underrepresented. The numbers, over 2/3 of UN countries have never had a woman leader. At the end of 2024, only 26 had a woman as a head of state or government. With regard to ministerial positions, at the beginning of 2024, only 23% of ministers with cabinet portfolios were women, and their share was even lower in conflict-affected countries, 19%. Only 22 of ministers of foreign affairs and 12% of ministers of defense were women, compared to 67% of ministers responsible for family and children, and 51% of ministers for social inclusion and development. As of March 2025, the European Union 27 had 5 female defense ministers, 18.5%, and 6 female foreign ministers, 22%. Of course, Kaja Kallas is the third woman to serve as EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. The members of NATO have a higher than average share of women in defense posts in general, with 8 female defense ministers. Reflecting on the status quo in academia and in politics, couldn't avoid to think about Margaret Thatcher. And although we all think of Margaret Thatcher as the Iron Lady, we need also to look at her public profile. According to her biographers, Margaret Thatcher appeared to avoid the confrontational nature of the House of Commons, which was more familiar to her male counterparts. And she limited her attendance to the bare minimum to avoid sexist attacks from colleagues. So I'm wondering if women today in IR look for niches or go to low politics debates to avoid visibility, to avoid attacks. And if a solution to gain more visibility and more influence is to participate in the big debates, to engage with traditional IR issues from women's perspective, not necessarily through the feminist agenda at the beginning, because I'm wondering if we are cornering ourselves and if we abide with stereotypes created from others for women. And Jana, allow me to offer two good practices. Good practice one, if you think of a panel discussing nuclear weapons, can you think of 5 women presenting their research? This is what the European Initiative for Security Studies did this summer. They hold inclusivity panels, and they had 5 women presenting their research on nuclear weapons. And also, my experience from the European International Studies Association Governing Board, an all-women governing board who made miracles to increase funding for underrepresented groups. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And finally, we have Dr. Hooser.
All right, thank you so much. I apologize in advance. There are kittens in my back garden and my dogs have been barking a lot. So I hope that they're going to be quiet for this. I'm so really grateful to be here and in conversation, both with the women on this panel and all the folks that are in the audience. I have been thinking a lot lately about the framing of my talk for today and what I would want to open with, what it is that I want to emphasize, and what I have been grappling with in my research and my teaching lately. And I think that the place to start is to say that I teach global politics in the city of Chicago. So this is a city right now that feels under siege, okay, where people are constantly being asked to prove their own right to exist, to pick up their children from school, to check their mail or go to the grocery store. Chicago right now is policed by ICE and the looming threat of National Guard troops. And so this city has been reminding me in a very real way daily that security is never evenly distributed and that peace is not a state that we reach, but it's a fragile practice that we build and enact together in spaces where we live and where we teach. And it's really from that vantage point that I've been thinking about the women, peace, and security agenda lately. So this is a project spearheaded by the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325. I think at its best, the WPS agenda imagined something really revolutionary, which was that women's lives, bodies, and knowledge matter in the making of peace. And that security is not only about armies and borders, but about the conditions that let people breathe and love and raise one another. And for me, that promise still really moves me. But I also want to take some time today to ask what happens when the woman at the center of that vision is a very particular kind of woman. So in my research, I'm thinking about heterosexual, married, often a mother, respectable in the eyes of the state, and what happens to the women who don't fit those narratives. So single women, childless women, queer and trans peace builders, folks who organize often without ever being invited to the table in the first place. So what does the WPS agenda do with their stories? So I wanted to share a little bit about some work that I've done in Burundi, where I think that I've seen the women, peace, and security agenda really travel. So how the lofty goals of the WPS agenda meet the kind of grain of everyday life. So in Burundi, international programs, often they arrive speaking the language of so-called gender inclusion, of empowering women as agents of peace. But on the ground, these promises have to pass through local norms and social economies, and in particular, ideas about who counts as respectable, who counts as a Burundian, who counts as a woman. And so I want to share an example of one encounter that I had is, so there's an afternoon during a community meeting on peace building where a local women's leader suggested something really interesting to me. She said the local ministry was really happy that the programming with this NGO was including women, but not those kinds of women. They said we invited the wrong women. And she didn't mean this cruelly, right? But she meant women who were unmarried, women who were uneducated, women who were too poor, women who were seen as not having families. And in this same program, one of the women participants who was invited to take part in the peace program testified, "We do not have the luxury of being queer here." And so these comments have really stayed with me as I think about the WPS agenda and its ability to transform institutions and create inclusion, because I think that these quotes carry with them both some resistance and also a little bit of realism. So I think there's a recognition here that the frameworks of inclusion that are offered by the WPS agenda assume conditions of safety and legitimacy that many women who are invited often simply do not have. And that the liberal peace model rewards certain forms of femininity. So women who are wifely and maternal, women who are willing and prepared to forgive, for example. But for the women who live outside those expectations, visibility can be really dangerous. So a program that promises inclusion can paradoxically demand conformity. So to be seen as a woman of peace, you might also have to appear modest, married, and morally upright. And I think that this moral surveillance is not separate from global politics. And I say that because I think that it's the same tension that we see today when inclusion is dismissed as woke, or when caring about gender justice is framed as ideological excess, right? Rather than everyday necessity. So in that sense, I think that the backlash against so-called wokeness that I might observe in Burundi is also happening in the US, and they're not as far apart as we might think. So I think that they're both relying on this nostalgia for a particular moral order that's built on gender hierarchy, and both turn inclusion into accusation. And I think they're also revealing how fragile the idea of women's peace work becomes when it threatens established power. And yet, amid all of these constraints, I have also encountered loads of women and queer people who quietly made peace differently. They form solidarity networks. They share childcare so others can attend trainings. They create what one woman called to me, our small peace between us. So their work didn't fit the measurable indicators of the WPS agenda and what we might be thinking about when we think about inclusion, but it was peace building nonetheless, right? And it's this kind of slow, relational, grounded in care and survival kind of peace work. And I think that these encounters have changed how I think about both feminist research and feminist pedagogy. Because what these women and these queer folks were doing was not so different from what we try to do in the classroom, I think, to create spaces of listening, of refuge, of disagreement that doesn't demand assimilation, and to really practice peace not as a consensus, right, but sort of staying with the tensions of complexity. But I think at the same time lately that this work has felt a lot heavier. So some folks in the room may have seen that earlier this year, the US Defense Secretary, or Secretary of War, if you've been following the transition, Pete Hegseth, announced he was ending the Pentagon's Women, Peace, and Security program, calling it, quote, woke and unnecessary. And this was a program that was born of bipartisan law, designed to protect and elevate women in conflict zones. And it's now being treated as a distraction from so-called real security problems. So I think that maybe this is a small story, but it belongs to a much larger one. And this is the steady erosion of democratic norms, the growing suspicion of care, empathy, and inclusion itself. So when inclusion gets treated as ideology rather than as a precondition for peace and justice, we see how deeply democracy depends on this kind of feminist work, right? On this insistence that every life counts as part of the political world. I think I'm perhaps approaching going over on time, so I'll try to wrap up soon. But I kind of want to end with, so what do we do as scholars, teachers, and peace builders in a moment where even care and inclusion are politicized? And I think that we've learned a lot from feminist scholars about the importance of listening and that listening is political, that knowledge is not just what we produce, but how we relate, that power runs through every encounter, and that our task is not to transcend that power, but to stay accountable within it. I think feminist scholarship helps us see the connections between the kind of spectacular violences of war and the quiet violences of everyday life. So that detention center, eviction, border checkpoint, hostile classroom even. And perhaps I think most importantly, feminist thought teaches us how to practice hope. So not as a feeling, but as a discipline. So I'll end with, I have this quote from Miriam Kaba. She's a prison abolitionist and activist in the US. And this quote is written large in the center of a whiteboard in my office as a reminder. It says, hope is a discipline. And I think that that's a really important thing for us to stay with in this current political moment globally. So hope is something that we train in together through repetition, through relationship, through small daily acts of refusing despair. And I think to teach feminist peace building is to practice that discipline, to keep imagining alternatives, even when the political climate narrows around us. Right.
Thank you so much, Kara, for your wonderful comments, and to all three panelists. You really, addressed some different ideas and important pillars of this conversation that we're having today. The role of women scholars, as well as women leaders in international relations, and the importance of feminist analysis. And thank you, Kara, for also, situating what's happening in the U.S. right now in this whole global framework of peace and how we can achieve that. Now, at least two of you did mention the WPS, the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda, and that is our first and so far only question in the Q&A. And for those of you who are mobile right now and cannot see the Q&A, I will read the gist of the question, and this is for all three panelists. It says, some feminist academics criticize the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda of having failed to stop the wars. It's not a huge responsibility for the WPS agenda to be accused that all efforts have failed to stop the wars, rather than unite female IR scholars to bolster the study of IR and crisis management at the global level. What is your view on this? Panelists, do either any of you want to jump in, or should we just go in order of who presented first? Maybe Debotri, can we start with you?
I would like to give the floor to Kara first because her research focuses on WPS, and I do have some comments to share too.
Great. I didn't want to skip the line, so thank you for the invitation. Yeah, that's a big question. Is it the responsibility of the WPS agenda to end wars? I think that, well, for one, the WPS agenda is relatively new, right? This is where it's celebrating its 25th anniversary. And in my eyes, there have been kind of two major goals of the WPS agenda. And one is to think more about inclusion, right? Inclusion in terms of protection, participation, and prevention. But the other goal has been to move beyond thinking about this kind of sexed bodies framework, right? A men and women framework, to say that we also aim at transforming the kind of gendered ways that we think about the world, our gendered definitions of security, our gendered reliance on militarization, right? And I think that though, I think Debotry has already highlighted that the inclusion part has not gone great so far, that we're still falling short of important goals in terms of even getting women into the room. I think that the call to transform the way we think about peace and security, the way we think about the tools we can use to pursue security and peace, that is an even kind of larger and more difficult goal to achieve. So I don't want to frame the WPS agenda as it's their, that it's the WPS agenda's fault that wars aren't stopped, but it is certainly a goal of the agenda to try to transform the way that people think about war and peace, such that we can get to a place where maybe the tools that we rely on are not militarized in nature. So that's what I have for that.
Thank you. And I'm sort of just joining in on that. Something I wanted to say because it's personally deeply meaningful for me to say. So I hope, Yana, you let me make this intervention. I've been reading in the chat all of the wonderful folks in the audience who've been putting their comments here. It is so incredibly powerful, you folks, that you've shown up and that you're a part of this community. And there's so many professors and associate professors from universities around the world, in the United States, in the global south. I'm seeing several countries represented here. There are many, many PhD candidates. I see one of my own students here, Archie. Hi. And we see, there's a lot of other PhD candidates. I think even from, I see a few other PhD candidates from other universities in India, and folks from the Philippines, folks from several countries in Africa, several in Europe. This is so powerful. When we are talking about all of the ways in which all of our lofty feminist goals have not been met from the time that we've been struggling for generations. Let's also take a moment to pause and see in this moment a great, great, great moment of hope. All of you could have been doing other things right now. You're here. You're a part of this community. We are a part of this community. And that is something that is so incredibly powerful. So I just wanted to take a moment to recognize that. And thank you so much. Our gratitude to you for being in community with us is deeply appreciated. Coming to the WPS agenda, I think I've already answered part of the question, that it is an uphill battle. It has always been. Anything that focuses on the dignity of human life, anything that focuses on people as opposed to, big wealth and the most, those kinds of things have always been things that have been looked at as alternative. And unfortunately, something that does happen is that the kind of spaces that do take up, those kind of battles, like feminist spaces, for example, or post-colonial spaces, or anti-racist work spaces, typically have to bear the disproportionate burden of sort of having to answer sometimes to why we haven't been able to get that utopia yet, right? But I think that because that is a disproportionate burden that we share. And but again, I locate hope in the fact that that work continues. I mean, I think something that we all, as those of us who have had anything at all to do with social justice, criminal justice, that kind of work, take great pride in, is the fact that no matter, and think about this, no matter what the challenges have been out there, we have kept on. We are still here. And that is something that is incredible, and that work is continuing. The other course that I teach at my university, apart from the gender violence and war course, is a feminist foreign policy course. And something I wanted to share with you all was that we're taking a comparative approach there and looking at several countries that adopted feminist foreign policies. Sweden was the first in Europe, and then later on there was a very reactionary government, and they had to sort of roll back. But what was very positive even in that case was that some of these policies, because the nature of policy is that once it's enacted on a macro level, it does get decentralized. And so even if you roll something back in theory, its effects don't go away. And so there's and so those kind of things are also positive. There are other countries in the global south that are adopting feminist foreign policies, and they're calling it such, and they are not also shying away from making the connection between foreign policy and domestic policy. Mexico is a case of, is an example. Argentina is an example. There are several examples like that where they're not shying away from recognizing the domestic challenges at home. Gender violence, again, being my area, I know that these are issues that our societies are struggling with, and globally. And so those are, again, strides forward. And I want to end with one quick happy thought, again, speaking of Rutgers. We are flying the Rutgers flag high at this point, I think. But as I was getting a lot of really sort of collecting material around introducing case studies and so forth, I came across several folks I personally knew, and some I studied with, and one who was at Rutgers, who are also working on feminist foreign policy. And we were working and we are collaborating with, our respective sort of governments and so forth. I did an event earlier with with our former foreign secretary, who was also the Indian ambassador to the United States. And so we are not everybody comes in on these conversations, but the fact that we are getting some people too, even in high spaces, is again a step forward. I don't know if, again, being from a women's and gender studies field, I've learned to be happy with small things sometimes, knowing that the big things are, we've been working for those. But I do want to end with that note of hope. And again, with that big thank you to all of you for being here with us in community. Yeah.
Thank you, Debotri. And I love how all three of you have emphasized this message of hope. I think we really do need that as a reminder right now. I don't see any more questions in the Q&A, so I do have a question for all three panelists. Let's see, did I just hear a voice?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Jana. May I also respond to the question?
Oh, yes, of course, Rebecca. I'm sorry. Go right ahead. And then I'll ask my question.
Yeah, I'm sorry for interrupting you, but I wanted to join the Debotri in recognizing the moment. And I have to say that I chaired online events before with EISA and ISA, and haven't seen that volume of exchanges and networking in the chat. And this also speaks tones with regard to what women can bring in the big debates and discussion we have now, more than 100 women and men from all around the world. So I also want to extend my gratitude to my colleague Fotini Bellu, who posed the question. Fotini does great work as she is the UNESCO chair holder for WPS in our department. So reflecting on our discussions with Fotini before, actually, I want to share my concern. Is the WPS agenda concerns unique to the feminist FPA agenda? Can we transform the field actually by bringing the concerns of the WPS agenda to the forefront and engage with traditional IR agenda more rather than demonizing each other? Let's cooperate and write more together in like interfield, inter-subfield cooperations in order to synthesize actually our views and our concerns, in order to avoid building walls between the subfields of the IR agenda. So I guess it's a call for an opening of the YPS agenda scholars to other subfields of IR.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I'm sorry to shortchange you there. So maybe you can go first in answering my question. So now I'm a feminist economist, and I can think of three specific ways in which feminist analysis in economics has impacted policy. in the last few decades. And that's my question for you. I'll give you my three examples in a moment. But my question for you to think about as I give you my examples is, how has feminist analysis in international relations affected policy over the past few decades? And the examples of feminist economics impacting policy, I think one is our scholarship on the value of care has really influenced policy around the globe in terms of governments investing more in care infrastructure and supporting the care work that women do, largely women do, let's say through childcare subsidies and investments in just in care, especially children, but also elder care. The second is feminist analysis of intra-household bargaining, has really gone against some of the standard neoclassical models to show that households are not one homogeneous unit and that there are bargaining differentials and differences in how resources are allocated in the home. And that's influenced policy with things like conditional cash transfers, where women receive the transfers from the government and decide how to spend that money. And the third area is the growth in scholarship, feminist scholarship on LGBTQ economics. And we've started to see, both in the US and abroad, more inclusive policies to bring in LGBTQ individuals, to make them less marginalized, to decriminalize same-sex relations, to legalize marriage, and to also reduce discrimination in the labor market. So those are three examples from economics. I'd like to hear your take on feminist analysis and the policy impact in international relations. Any one of you can go first.
Shall I go as an outsider, what I'm saying from the outside in? Apart from the WPS agenda, I think the most important contributions are contributions to the human security agenda and the development agendas, where feminist analysis has an impact. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that another contribution regards comprehensive approaches with regard to security and agenda, and with regard to the European security and defense policy, as well as NATO also is concerned.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Debotri, do you mind if I go next?
Yeah, please do.
Well, I think for me, the obvious answer is the women, peace, and security agenda, right? The WPS agenda, it's both a kind of space of policymaking and also an activist movement, and also an area of scholarly interest in feminist study and analysis. So I'm not sure I'll make the causal claim that feminist scholars made the WPS agenda happen, because I don't think that's a fair reflection of all of the work that feminist activists were also doing on the ground. But I think that there's a lot of symbiosis across those communities and a lot of learning that happens. And despite some of the pitfalls that we've discussed with the WPS agenda so far today, it has accomplished some really amazing things in the world. It has increased inclusion in peace building, and then we can kind of discuss what that inclusion means and what we would like it to look like compared to what it has looked like. But it has increased inclusion. I know in particular, like, there are countries around the world who implement national action plans that profess what their state plans to do policy-wise to adhere to the priorities of the WPS agenda. Lots of countries are taking part in that, and there's new national action plans every few years. WPS agenda has led to the inclusion of gender quotas in peacebuilding agreements, for instance. In particular in Burundi, the gender quota for national level government offices has been met every year since the peace agreement was signed. So that's unprecedented that's happening. Yeah, and maybe I'll stop there. There have been a lot of changes to peace agreements, kind of hand in hand with the growth of the WPS agenda as well, in terms of different kinds of gender provisions and thinking about the role of women as ex-combatants and what it might look like to reintegrate women as ex-combatants. And so I think a lot of really important policy changes have actually happened as a result of it.
Thank you for emphasizing that. And Cara, I wanted to say I absolutely loved something you'd said earlier about how some of this work is about allowing those that haven't been given that right to breathe and love and raise one another, and how, and something else you said about how a lot of this analysis isn't about ideological excess, but that it is everyday necessity. Because I think a lot of times, feminist or whatever we want to call it, socially just analysis or analysis that is focused on the ethics and of everyday life, and that it often has to face that charge that it's ideological. We don't typically posit that charge every time there is a panel which is not discussing feminist issues, right? Or using the word feminist, we don't automatically point and say, oh, you have a patriarchal agenda, you have an androcentric agenda. But feminism, unfortunately, like many other social justice discourses, does get that name a lot of times. But if we do move beyond, some of those, some of the bigger burdens, actually, that, those of us who do some of this work face, I think it's such a great question, Yana. So thank you for directing us towards that and sort of saying, what are the real ways in which feminist analysis has actually affected policy. Speaking from an Indian perspective, I can say that one of the biggest changes that has happened, and this was something that was again highlighted by, not just the foreign secretary, but a couple of diplomats that I was speaking to, and I was asking them, what are the changes that have happened that would, do you think there have been changes that have happened in the field of diplomacy that first and foremost allow women who would have had to leave their jobs to keep working, to not have to exit the labor force? And the answer to that was an overwhelming yes, which I was very happy to hear. So there have been actually very real changes, and I'm pretty sure this is, this could be mirrored in the policies of several other governments and several other countries, really. It's not just about a single government; it's about that there have been policies allowing married women, for example, who had to exit the workforce before that, and they had to go to tag along with their husbands wherever they were posted. Now those kind of concerns are kept in mind. There have been other kinds of things that have allowed people to just stay in the labor force, which is really the first step, because that's the first thing that's happening. I was reading a column in the New York Times which was saying that even in America, women are exiting the labor force now, and we saw a lot of that during COVID, and we saw a lot of that, but we're seeing that kind of trend. And so, to my mind, first and foremost, keeping the women, is the first step, and then then we move to the next set of policies. I know, again, speaking to the point that Rebecca raised about breaking the silos, and sort of speaking to these different subfields, something that has also happened, not nearly as much as I would like to see, but it has started happening for a while now, is about gender sensitization of militaries. And I know I'm treading like that's a huge, sort of thing to sort of step into, but I'm just saying we had to start somewhere. And we had to start with talking about the disproportionate ways and exactly the kind of things that I was saying earlier, in which women are affected, what happens to, and so there's spaces in the world that are doing that kind of training. I know we need a lot of that in South Asia. We need a lot of sort of a gender lens on, because there is, I'm speaking from from a part of the world where countering violent extremisms has been an issue, right? And so how do we do that in a way that is not taking away more from the communities that are already affected? and how do we bring a gender lens to that. That is something that we're kind of trying to do here. Other kind of ways in which feminist analysis has affected international relations in the practice is again the hiring of people like me. I mean, really, I am at a very mainstream university in a very mainstream international relations department, and I have been able to badger the people enough to let me teach a course on feminist foreign policy. I consider that a small little win, and so because that's how we build networks. When we talk about it, even if you have 30 students in a class, it's those 30 people, and within that, you can probably make believers out of some of those, and then that work continues and those networks get built. And so again, those little slivers of hope, that's also affected. So our pedagogies, traditional IR curricula tends to again not have these, as these courses are typically electives, and I'm very hopeful that I will be able to badger folks enough to make something like this into a core elective going forward, and I will share it with you if I succeed on that front. But so these are also things that are important, where we talk about, like you have a course on nuclear policy, for example, which is a core course, and then something on gender violence and war or a feminist foreign policy would typically be an elective. How do we bring these things into curricula? That is also a way to break the silos, right? Because the silos were not created by those fighting for social justice. So the traditional spaces have to be willing to accommodate us more, and then we can have that that conversation. And so these are just some of the ways in which practicing diplomats, those that are working also in, because again, I hesitate to only use that term for those that officially hold a position, because there are women, again, at a grassroots level, that are working tirelessly, building their communities. That work is also happening, though they don't have a tag of diplomat. And so the kind of ways in which some differences can be made to their lives, the kind of ways in which those that hold formal positions can continue in positions of power, and in positions first and foremost, power might may come later. The ways in which we can then translate some of these into not just preaching to the choir, which is feminist think tanks and policy spaces and all of that, but that we can translate it into gender sensitizing militaries. We can translate it into sending funding where it is needed to rebuild these communities and the people whose lives have been the worst affected, and to have some degree of state accountability, because again, those are concerns too, especially in conflict affected areas. So all of those are ways. And finally, again, I am so grateful to Rebecca for bringing up that point when we were kind of collectively thinking about the points we wanted to include, thinking about how we contribute as scholars and educators. And so the final point, again, I'd like to again emphasize is the idea of curricula, that if we are adding, and I know all of us are doing that work, that we are bringing in these concerns into not just our curricula, but striving endlessly to sort of bring it to mainstream these concerns, so that we are not just speaking to our own little cohorts of believers. I think these are all of the ways in which these policies have and continue to affect the field in positive ways.
Thank you, Debotri. It is time to wrap up. I think for our closing comments, the second question in the Q&A is probably a nice, hopeful way to, speaking of hope and the importance of hope, one of our participants from the Philippines, who I think is a younger scholar, asked for a few words of encouragement and advice for beginners, this participant, as they start their journey towards learning more about IR and hopefully create a lot of impact. So in your closing comment for each of our panelists, if you can please give a word of encouragement and maybe one message of advice for young scholars. Rebecca, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I would say brace yourselves for the turbulence, and also dare to go where you love. No matter if this is a men-dominated topic or one great debate in IR, go and claim your position. You have a voice, make it loud.
Thank you, Rebecca. Kara, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thank you. Oh, and that's That message is so touching too. I'm so excited to know that there are early researchers in the room or young students that are on here. I'm thinking about what that was like when I first started with my PhD and decided semester one that I was going to study feminist IR, and everyone was like, "You're going to do what? Why would you do that to yourself?" So I think, if I learned anything on that what Rebecca is right to say turbulent journey looks like, is that it's really important to find and build your community, right? To seek out things like what we're doing here today, to find other women and people who will support you and support your research. And I think that community is crucial for being able to maintain hope in this space, right? And then cling to hope, I think, is an also important lesson that we've had for today. But I'm so excited that people are here. Thank you.
Thank you, Kara. Devotri.
I just wanted to echo what the others have said, and yes, make your voice loud and claim your space. And again, the point that Cara made too, that find your community, especially for those of you who are starting out. See, we take different trajectories to kind of ultimately always arrive at that which calls to us the most. I know I started out with actually working on gender in domestic policies, and then sort of realizing the cross-cultural connections, and then moving to IR through that. And my work was again made possible at a doctoral level by a very generous scholarship from Rutgers, and then it sort of continued on and so forth. And in that process, again, something that I learned is that you will always meet people who will give you that sense of community. So find those people, find that professor who's passionate about this, find that that other professor who's willing to work with you on this and is kind of willing to get transformed a little bit by your passion, right? And something that I know I hear a lot, and maybe there are folks that will disagree with me on this, but I have always believed this, and I will always believe it, that if you're passionate about something, don't let people discourage you. Don't let people discourage you, because that happens a lot, and continue with that. Find your people, find communities, find the work that makes you find a sense of meaning and worth, because that is also important. We live in a world that focuses on the practical side of things so much, and that's important too. Like, we need to put food on the table, but at the same time, to be able to do that in a way while we're also able to do work that speaks to our hearts, that's the best sort of life, right? And so strive towards that. And I think something very practical that we can do is we can put, especially for those of you who are early career scholars, we can put our emails in the chat box. So you can drop us an email, and we can sort of keep in touch and so forth. And I'm sure we'll have more conversations like this going forward. But this sense of community is what I know I'm feeling deeply grateful for it right now. And because we do have, no matter how brave we come across to the world, we do have our moments, where we feel like we would like a greater sense of community. We'd like to be included, and we would like to include. And so find that for yourselves, and do not let people discourage you from what your heart knows is the way for you forward. Yeah.
Thank you, Devotri. And on a very practical note, if you go to the chat and you click on those three little dots, the horizontal dots, you can save the chat, and then you will have information about everybody who participated today. You can reach out to them. It will download the entire chat to your computer. Kat also posted some links in the chat on
Yana,
becoming
could you
active.
repeat that? How do we do that?
Oh.
How do we save the chat?
Oh, in the chat, when you open up the chat, at the bottom part where it says type message here, look to the right, and you should see three horizontal dots. At least for me, it's on the very far right of the chat box. If you click on the three horizontal dots, it says save the chat. And then you can save it downloads the entire chat to your computer. Or you can quickly Google on the side, how do I save my Zoom chat if my instructions are not clear? But part of the chat, Kat has put in some links on becoming more active with the ISA. There is an early career let me see, I'm not seeing the full thing, several links for becoming more involved with the ISA. So I would encourage you to follow those links and definitely get active, just like our panelists said. So a big, big thank you to our wonderful panelists. I learned a lot myself, and I'm a senior scholar in economics, but I learned a lot today. Thank you. And I hope to stay in touch with all three of you. Debotri, I know we'll stay in touch. And yes, please follow up with our panelists later on if you'd like to stay connected. Thanks again, and goodbye, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank you
Jana.
so
Thank
much. Thank you.
you.